JD Vance has emerged as the breakout star of the US election campaign. The Ohio senator has blown audiences away with his slick communication style and killer debating skills, often wiping the floor with Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, and the leftist media. This week has been no different, with Vance out on the campaign trail schooling naysayers. Sky News All Stars James Morrow, Douglas Murray, and Josh Hammer take a look at JD Vance's latest triumphs and ask whether his stellar performances are helping to move the dial towards a Trump-Vance victory. JD Vance is on fire. The relatively unknown senator from Ohio has stormed into the spotlight and is exposing cracks in Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, and the leftist media's propaganda machine. JD Vance today called out Kamala Harris for allegedly plagiarizing parts of her book.
I saw today, actually, a story that Kamala Harris apparently copied some significant chunks of her book from Wikipedia. So if you want a president with their own ideas, vote for Donald Trump.
And it's not only Kamala Harris he obliterates. JD Vance went head-to-head with an ABC News anchor and exposed the absurdity of her argument, reveals Sky News All-Star James Morrow.
Can we have a quick chat here about JD Vance, Donald Trump's vice presidential nominee? And you'll recall when he was named, a lot of people doubted this pick. They thought, ooh, gee, this guy's weird. He's got the cat lady stuff. You know, there's no way he's going to connect. He's going to be a terrible performer. But I gotta say, he has turned out to be something of a superstar here, particularly when it comes to turning the tables on establishment media, you know, the CNN and New York Times types, and exposing what a weird bubble all those people who are telling Americans that they absolutely have to vote for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. Well, what a strange bubble they live in. Now, several weeks ago, you'll recall, the news broke that violent Venezuelan gangs had taken over apartment complexes in Aurora, Colorado. This was big news, at least it was in some quarters, but check out this. I love this here. This exchange with ABC News' Martha Raddatz and JD Vance, and check out how she tries to play it off, this idea that gangs of Venezuelan migrants have taken over apartment complexes. It's no big deal.
The incidents were limited to a handful of apartment complexes, and the mayor said our dedicated police officers have acted on those concerns. A handful of problems.
Only, Martha, do you hear yourself? Only a handful of apartment complexes in America were taken over by Venezuelan gangs, and Donald Trump is the problem and not Kamala Harris's open border? Americans are so fed up with what's going on, and they have every right to be. And I really find this exchange, Martha, sort of interesting because you seem to be more focused with nitpicking everything that Donald Trump has said rather than acknowledging that apartment complexes in the United States of America are being taken over by violent gangs.
Just a handful of apartment complexes? I mean, come on, what are people so upset about? Think of the vibrancy and the cuisines that are being brought in by these Venezuelan gangs. And I'll tell you what, JD Vance is absolutely onto something there, because had those apartment complexes been in someplace like Arlington, Virginia, next to Washington, D.C., you know, I think people like Martha Raddatz would care, but out there in Aurora, Colorado, well, what do they care about that inside the Beltway?
And this interaction drew huge applause from online commentators, with this person saying, JD Vance tortures ABC's Martha Raddatz after she minimized the illegal immigrant gang takeovers because only a handful of apartments complexes have been seized. He then doubled down, schooling a New York Times reporter on illegal immigration.
Then there was this exchange with the New York Times' Lulu Garcia-Navarro, and I think this is also quite telling. I want to play this for you because it exposes all the biases for people to see. Watch the look on Navarro's face at the end of this exchange.
About a third of the construction workforce in this country is Hispanic. Of those, a large proportion are undocumented. So how do you propose to build all the housing necessary that we need in this country? By removing all the people who are working in construction. I mean, I'm not arguing in favor of illegal immigration. I'm asking how you would deal with the knock-on effect of your proposal to remove millions of people who work in a critical part of the economy.
Well, I think that what you would do is you would take, let's say, for example, the 7 million prime-age men who have dropped out of the labor force, and you have a smaller number of women, but still millions of women prime-age who have dropped out of the labor force. You absolutely could re-engage folks into the American labor market. This is, I think...
To work in construction?
Of course you could.
To work in construction? Oh my God, the horror, how icky! Who would want to work in construction? My word. This mentality, though, of the New York Times bubble, and it's the same thing here in Australia, by the way, is so telling. But it's also self-defeating because, as the Wall Street Journal reported this week, guess who the new millionaire class is in America? It's plumbers and skilled tradies and entrepreneurs, which I gotta say must be some pretty sour news if you're sitting around in Brooklyn or someplace like that, paying off a $200,000 gender studies degree where all you learned was to identify as a cat.
This also attracted a lot of praise online, with this commentator saying, "What JD Vance does to this Times reporter is illegal in some states, a masterclass in deconstructing a false premise." And no one can forget Vance's obliteration of Tim Walz during the VP debate, revealed Sky News All-Star Douglas Murray.
Well, you know, the received wisdom, Rita, is that VP picks don't have that much influence on the race. That I don't think is actually true. I think they do have more influence than is often said. But it's also often said that the VP debates don't have all that much influence. And again, I don't think that's the case on this occasion. This was the first time for the American public to see JD Vance and Tim Walz going head to head and to judge both men. I have to say, I mean, I think that it's pretty clear and that the New York Times was for once right. I think the evening was JD Vance's. He seemed to be on top of all of the issues that came up. He was respectful. He was sharp. He was likable and much more. And Tim Walz was, to use one of his own favorite words, well, he was weird. He looked all the time as if he had walked in from somewhere else, from some other set or some other job application. Looked like somebody who turned up for the wrong job interview and then was rather startled to discover it was the vice presidential debate. And of course, he had the worst moment of the evening when he was asked about why he lied about being in China at the time of Tiananmen Square. And he replied by saying, "I think the American public, know that I grew up in a house with a family among Americans, and we used to have food on the table, and we had a table and food, and he just I mean, even the biased moderators did end up, after about what felt like 48 hours of this waffle, did end up saying, yeah, but what about your claim that you were in Tiananmen Square?" And he did that great Clintonism. I think a word that wasn't in the language until the Clintons, which was, "I misspoke." And, I mean, I suppose it could happen to any of us, Rita. I sometimes claim to have been at the D-Day landings. I often claim to have been there waving the Titanic off as she set sail. It's easily done. And it's just, if you do catch me doing it, Rita, I just misspoke. That's all.
It's an innocent mistake, and I know you grew up in a household with a family, and you had your dinners on tables with four legs. So it's all tables.
And just this week, JD Vance blasted Tim Walz again, this time for abandoning his own hard-working police officers during the 2020 George Floyd riots in Minneapolis.
First, I just want to say a little bit about what this building behind us represents. So you can see it's all boarded up. This is, of course, the headquarters of the 3rd Precinct, which was burned down. Thanks to Tim Walz's completely failed leadership. And, talking to these folks behind me, I mean, these are law enforcement officers. A lot of them were here, some of them for many days when this was allowed to happen. And remember, during those riots, these guys were given up for dead. Their police chief told them to stand down, hoping that it would save their lives. A couple of them just told me just now their fear that they would be killed by the violent mob that was attacking this precinct. And the important question is, what were their leaders, in particular, what was Governor Tim Walz doing to keep these officers safe and to bring order to the city of Minneapolis? The answer was absolutely nothing. They described being left for dead by the person who wants to be the Vice President of the United States. And to all the folks who are watching this, I think the message is very simple. That do we want a kind of leader who stands with the law enforcement, who fights for them, who protects their lives as they go about keeping us safe? Or do we want someone who encourages rioters and looters to burn down this precinct, who leaves the officers for dead, and then a president who then bails out some of those same rioters and looters out of prison? I think we want the law and order president. We want somebody who stands with our law enforcement, and most importantly, who stands with the communities that depend on law enforcement, and that means we want Donald J. Trump as president.
And it seems the more people see JD Vance, the more they like him and want him to be a key leader for the country, reveals Newsweek editor-at-large Josh Hammer.
Let's look at how JD Vance is performing. He was brilliant in the debate against Tim Walz, and he's been out again taking aim at Kamala Harris's train wreck interviews. Here he is.
But she walks into The View, and you would think that would be an interview, and you know what they asked her? They gave her a softball, an easy question. Really propaganda. They said, can you name a single thing where you disagree with Joe Biden? You know what she says? I can't really think of anything off the top of my head. Now, in her defense, I'm not sure she could think of anything off the top of her head, whether about Joe Biden's policies or anything else.
Josh, this is what I suspect is happening right now. The more people watch JD Vance, the more they get to know JD Vance, the more that they like him. They respect him, they realize that he's quite smart, and the opposite is happening with Kamala Harris. The more that they see her, they realize there's not much there.
Yeah, look, Gabrielle, not to toot my own horn, but I guess I will briefly do it. I wrote an op-ed way back in March calling on Donald Trump to make JD Vance his vice presidential pick. I have known JD in a personal capacity for probably 5 or 6 years. I consider him a friend. And I was so happy that in that vice presidential debate, the world saw the JD Vance that I have gotten to know, which is a deeply, deeply thoughtful person who has a command of the material, who has done the reading, both proverbially and literally speaking. He understands public policy. He understands law. And he understands also the American people, as he famously wrote about in his best-selling memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, which turned into a Hollywood blockbuster film. You know, he really is all that. And in many ways, he represents the future of the Republican Party and the future of perhaps even just the Western, if not the outright global right, because he is just that articulate and I think understands the issues at that visceral of a level. And it is a very, very, very stark contrast to Kamala Harris. But